Just off the coast of Texas is an island known as Galveston. It's a city rich in history. My name is Linda MacDonald, and I'm a fourth-generation Galvestonian. As a BOI, that's a local designation for those born on the island, I'm very proud of my city's history. Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked here in 1528, and pirates such as Jean Lafitte used Galveston's natural harbor. In 1839, the city of Galveston was established on the eastern end of Galveston Island. Michael Menard, the founder of the city, wanted the city laid out in a very simple grid pattern. The young surveyor who planned the city went way to the east as far as he could go on the island without going into the swamps. And he called that first street 8th Street, wanted to leave room for growth. Then 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, all the way down to 57th Street. Next he went to the bay, and there was a little wagon trail that went along the waters of the bay. And he called that first street A, and then B and C and D and so on. But even that wasn't simple enough for the islanders, what with having to run through the alphabet every time you wanted to find a street. So they simplified things. A Street ran along the water, so they called it Water Street. B looked an awful lot like a street in London known as the Strand, so they called it the Strand. D went by the markets, and it became Market Street. One block over, Avenue E ran by the state's first post office, and it became Post Office Street. The young surveyor who laid out the city was a little eccentric. Most men in that time period rode around on horses. He preferred to ride a pet bull. He also liked to come up with unusual inventions, such as putting ship sails on a wagon to help him speed down the beach. In the early 1850s, this surveyor came up with another invention, a way to condense milk. People in Galveston were a little hesitant about this invention from a man who rode around on a bull. So the surveyor took his invention to New York City. The surveyor's name was Gail Borden, and people in Galveston said, well, I guess that's the last we'll hear of Borden and the Milk Company. The city of Galveston was growing, primarily because of its position as a port city. In 1861 came the Civil War. At first, the Union forces attempted a blockade of the city, but in October of 1862, they decided the blockade was too expensive to keep going. So they sent a messenger into the city, and the messenger said, surrender your city, or we will turn our cannons upon you and pound you into the ground. To this, the people of Galveston responded, cool, we surrender. So the Yankee forces came into the city. The people of Galveston ran to greet them. The Union officer wasn't too sure about the islanders and if they were really going to surrender their city. So he decided to have a forced march to the county courthouse. The mayor was there to greet him, and he turned the keys of the county courthouse over to this captain. The people of Galveston thought it was a parade, so as the Union troops marched down 20th Street, they came out and cheered them on. But the people of Texas said, what are you doing in Galveston? We don't just surrender. Remember the Alamo? Texans don't surrender. So the Confederacy sent General John Bankhead Magruder to save the islanders from the Yankee invaders. General John Bankhead Magruder was a graduate of West Point. He had already lost an arm to fighting in the East. It was said that he could ride all day and dance all night. The general launched a three-pronged attack beginning the morning of January the 1st, 1863. At 5 o'clock in the morning, 21 cannons from B Street, the Strand, started firing at the Yankee ships in the harbor. General John Bankhead Magruder fired the first cannon himself, and he said, I've done my duty as a private. Now, if you need me, I'll be at headquarters doing my duty as a general. The general had ships come in from the bay with bales of cotton on them and Confederate troops hiding behind them, shooting at the Union forces. Railroad cars came in from Houston with artillery mounted on flatbed cars. That was the first time in the history of military warfare that mobile artillery was ever used. Well, the Union troops were being shot at from so many different directions, they didn't know quite what to do. One of the biggest ships in the harbor was the Westfield. The captain aboard that ship told his men, let's just get out of the harbor, quickly, get out of the harbor. In their haste to get out of the harbor, they ran into a sandbar. So the captain told his men, quickly, set charges, we'll blow the ship up right here. So his men set the charges, and they got in the boats and rowed to safety. They waited for the Westfield to blow up. And they waited, and nothing happened. Well, the Confederate troops were also watching this, and they figured if the Union troops had left the ship, certainly there were charges sent, so they weren't going to go out there either. So the two forces simply watched the Westfield. Finally, the captain of the Westfield said, gosh, I've made two real career-altering decisions here. First of all, running into the sandbar in my haste to get out of the harbor, and now I've just left the ship there to be turned over to the enemy. So he told his men, everybody back on board the ship. Everybody, quickly. So the men rowed back out to the Westfield. But as soon as they reached the Westfield, the ship exploded, killing the captain and most of his crew. The other big ship in the harbor was the Harriet Lane. Her captain was Captain Jonathan Wainwright. He was killed shortly after the start of the battle. Much later, that Captain Jonathan Wainwright would have a grandson and namesake who would also pursue a military career and would become General Jonathan Wainwright, who surrendered to the Japanese on the Philippine Islands. Once Captain Wainwright was shot, his executive officer assumed command. His name was Lieutenant Commander Edward Lee. He was a very popular young officer. His men rallied around him and continued the fight. But when Lieutenant Commander Lee was shot, his men surrendered. The Confederate troops boarded the Harriet Lane. Among them was an officer. His name was Major Alfred Lee. And as Major Alfred Lee boarded the ship, the executive officer, whose last name was also Lee, looked up and said, "Hey boys, my father's here." And with that, Major Lee of the Confederacy held his very own son in his arms as the young man died. And it's said at that time, aboard that ship, all the adrenaline of the battle was gone. There was only great shame and great sadness at this greatest of American tragedies. The battle was over by noon. Galveston was again in the hands of the Confederacy. General John Bankhead Magruder was the hero of the Battle of Galveston. Galveston remained in the hands of the Confederacy until the end of the Civil War. That's a source of great pride for those of us in Galveston. We tend to overlook that little indiscretion about the surrendering. What was it like in Galveston after the Civil War? Put yourself here for a moment. Texas is no longer a state, it's a military district. Galveston has been subjected to a terrible Union blockade, so supplies have been limited. There's no fresh drinking water. All the water has to be brought into the city. There are frequent storms that bring in floodwaters, leaving behind ponds that breed mosquitoes. There are mosquitoes, rattlesnakes, crocodiles. And there are diseases of every kind, including smallpox, diphtheria, and yellow fever. In 1866, Claude Dubuis, bishop of the Catholic diocese that then encompassed the entire state, issued a call in his native France. He invited religious sisters to come to Galveston to care for the sick and infirm. Now think about what he's asking them to do. He's asking them to leave behind their homeland, leave their language, customs, their security, and risk their lives crossing the ocean to come here to Galveston, where there are storms, creatures that bite, and diseases that kill. 3 sisters answered that call: Mother Blandine, Sister Ange, and Sister Joseph. And they really did have to risk their lives coming to Galveston. In fact, the ship that left just ahead of them was lost at sea. There were 260 people aboard that ship, and only 17 survived. Now, those first 3 sisters knew that, so they were a little hesitant about getting aboard their ship to come to Galveston. But the bishop told them, remember, the road to heaven is shorter by sea than by land. So with that bit of encouragement, those first 3 sisters boarded the ship and came to Galveston. In October of 1866, Mother Blandine, Sister Ange, and Sister Joseph arrived in Galveston. Here they founded the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. The hospital they were to open was still under construction. The sisters were taken to the Ursuline convent, where they stayed for several months and began to learn the English language. The Ursulines operated a school for girls, Ursuline Academy, and it was considered one of the premier educational centers for girls in the state. The Ursulines asked their students if someone would be willing to work with these 3 new arrivals from France. Mary Dahmer volunteered. She said, I'll help them. Mary Dahmer was born in Germany. She came to Galveston when she was 6 years old with her mother. By the time she was 12 years old, she was already fluent in not only her native language of German, but also English, French, and Latin. She worked with our first 3 sisters. She took them around the city, and she helped them to learn the English language. On April the 1st, 1867, Charity Hospital was opened by the Sisters of Charity. It was none too soon. That was April the 1st. By May the 1st, there was word of yellow fever in Cuba. June 1st, yellow fever was in Texas. By the 1st of July, yellow fever was killing 3 people every day in Galveston. By the 1st of August, 30 people were dying every day in Galveston. On the 15th of August, Mother Blandine, the superior of the small congregation of 3, was stricken. She died 3 days later. Sister Ange was also stricken with yellow fever, and she was incapacitated for the next year. It fell to Mother Joseph to keep the hospital going. She was 27 years old. Through the help of community leaders and physicians, Mother Joseph continued the congregation and continued the hospital. She worked practically around the clock. When she wasn't helping patients in the hospital, helping with their medical needs, helping to provide spiritual care, or caring for the many children that had been left behind by parents who had died of yellow fever, she was in the convent taking care of Sister Ange. Finally, the yellow fever epidemic passed. It was the last and the greatest yellow fever epidemic in Galveston. The hospital continued. More sisters arrived to help Mother Joseph. In 1869, the name of the hospital was changed from Charity Hospital to St. Mary's Infirmary. Also that year, the sisters established an orphanage within the hospital. In 1874, construction began on a new St. Mary's Infirmary. This building was designed by Nicholas Clayton, the first professional architect in the state. It was a grand 3-story building built with 500,000 bricks purchased in Houston. There were 150 beds in it. At about the same time that the new St. Mary's Infirmary was being constructed, a site was identified for a new orphanage. It was outside the city limits. It was between a bayou and the Gulf on land known as the Greens Estate. It seemed a perfect place for the children. They had plenty of room to romp and play. There was plenty of wildlife and sea life, lots of flowers. But most important, it was far from town and the threat of yellow fever. In 1875, the orphanage opened. 20 orphans moved in, and construction began on a new dormitory. That same year, a terrible hurricane struck Galveston. It was the worst hurricane to date. When that hurricane hit, Mother Joseph was in St. Mary's Hospital. She was the superior at the orphanage, but she was in the hospital on business. The storm came up so fast that she wasn't able to get back to the orphanage, but she wanted to. The moment the storm passed, she said, I need to get back out there. I want to check on the children. And the sisters told her, you can't go out there. I mean, the roads have all been flooded. There's no way a wagon can even get out there. You can't go. And she said, I have to check on my little ones. So Mother Joseph borrowed a horse, and she rode horseback in full habit out past the city limits, out to the orphanage to check on the children. When she arrived, she found that all the original buildings of the Greens Estate had been destroyed, but the sisters and the children were safely huddled in the one new dormitory that had just been built. After that time, Mother Joseph became a little apprehensive whenever she heard that there was a storm in the Gulf. She would go to the second-story balcony of St. Mary's Infirmary and look out over the Gulf. And she always said that she hoped she would never have to see another devastating storm like the one of 1875. Mother Joseph, the last of the original three sisters who founded the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. Mother Joseph, who had done so much to keep the hospital, the congregation, and the orphanage going during the darkest days of the yellow fever epidemic. Mother Joseph. She never wanted to see another storm like the one of 1875. She died the summer of 1900. She died just prior to the greatest hurricane of all times, the 1900 storm. The 1900 storm. It's considered the greatest natural disaster ever to strike the United States. 6,000 men, women, and children were killed. 3,600 homes were destroyed. The winds reached 120, maybe 150 miles an hour. The water rose 20 feet. But these are just numbers, mere statistics. What's really important is that the great 1900 storm forever changed the lives of 36,000 people living here in Galveston at that time. It was September the 7th, 1900, when Dr. Isaac Klein first raised the hurricane warning flags. He told the people of Galveston that there was a storm in the Gulf. It was hitting for a very vulnerable, a very exposed Galveston Island. The same proximity to the sea that had made the city grow and prosper was to change Galveston Island forever. Now, Dr. Isaac Klein was a very practical man, a very meticulous man. He believed that every day you should spend 8 hours sleeping, 8 hours working, and 8 hours doing something involving recreation. Now, he considered recreation doing anything that improved your mind, your body, your spirit. So for recreation, he went back to school. And after earning his Doctor of Philosophy degree, he earned his medical degree in his spare time. In September of 1900, Dr. Klein had been chief of the Weather Bureau here for 11 years. He had been in the Weather Bureau itself for 18 years. He was married to Cora May, one of those sweet, kind, nice people that everyone just loved. In fact, when they got married, people wondered about strict, structured Isaac Klein and sweet Cora May. But 9 months, almost to the date, after their wedding, they had their first child. And everyone said, "That's Isaac Klein. Everything has a schedule." That September of 1900, Isaac Klein and his wife, Cora, had 3 children, and she was expecting their 4th child. Dr. Klein's brother, Joseph, was also in the Weather Bureau, and he resided at the Klein home. It was September the 8th, 1900. It's the darkest day in the history of the city. Beginning early that morning of September the 8th, the winds came in strong from the north, and they drove in the waters of the bay. Now, usually when this happens, when the wind comes in strong from the north, it pushes the waters of the Gulf out. That didn't happen this morning. The winds came in strong from the north, driving in the waters of the bay, but the waters of the Gulf were also rising. Dr. Isaac Klein noted this, and he and his brother became concerned. Dr. Klein and his brother Joseph reasoned that when the wind shifted, Galveston would be in for a devastating hurricane. Dr. Klein sent his brother Joseph on to the Weather Bureau, and Dr. Klein hitched his horse to a 2-wheel cart, and he went up and down the beach warning people to seek higher ground, to move into the heart of the city. Now, most people looked at him and sort of wondered because higher ground in Galveston is relative. The area along the beachfront was 2.5 feet above sea level. Downtown is 4.5 feet. And the highest altitude in the city is at 14th and Broadway, where it's 8.7 feet above sea level. 8.7 feet above sea level, and somewhere out in the Gulf is a 20-foot tidal surge coming full force for Galveston. Around noon that day, Zachary Scott left St. Mary's Hospital and went to the train station. He wanted to get a ticket to go home to Waco to be with his parents. Zachary was 19 years old, and he had been working as an orderly in St. Mary's Hospital. That fall, he was scheduled to begin classes at the University of Texas Medical Branch, just a few blocks from St. Mary's Hospital. When he got to the ticket station, the man told him there would be no more trains leaving Galveston. The tracks in Galveston were already starting to get underwater, but on the mainland, they were already 4 feet underwater. There would be no more leaving the city. Those in Galveston were destined to share the 1900 storm. There were folks on Bolivar Peninsula just across the bay from Galveston, and they knew the impending storm meant that they needed to get to higher ground. So they took a train and rode to the end of Bolivar Peninsula, expecting to catch the ferry to come into Galveston. But when they got to the ferry landing, they found that the seas were too rough. The ferries were no longer running. So some 50 people went to the lighthouse. That lighthouse still stands on Bolivar Peninsula. It was built in 1872. Those 50 people went in the lighthouse, and for the next 15 hours, they continued to go up and up and up in the dark inside this lighthouse as the storm raged. Zachary Scott decided, well, if he couldn't leave Galveston, he'd return to St. Mary's Hospital. About the same time that he came back to the hospital, Sister Elizabeth Ryan was boarding a wagon in the back. Sister Elizabeth Ryan was 33 years old and from Ireland. She was one of 10 sisters at the orphanage. Sister Elizabeth had come into the hospital to collect provisions to take out to the orphanage. Mother Gabriel was the assistant superior at St. Mary's, and until recently she had been the superior out at the orphanage. Mother Gabriel tried to encourage Sister Elizabeth Ryan to stay in the hospital until after the storm passed. But Sister Elizabeth Ryan said she couldn't stay. She said she had the food in the wagon, and if she didn't get back to the orphanage, there would be no supper that evening. She didn't know that whether she returned or not, there would be no more suppers at the orphanage. So Sister Elizabeth Ryan boarded the wagon and returned to the orphanage on the West End. Shortly after lunch, Dr. Isaac Klein had finished riding up and down the beach, so he went to the Weather Bureau. There he composed the last message to leave Galveston before the storm. He warned the Weather Bureau of the opposing winds and how the Gulf was still rising. He gave the message to his brother Joseph and asked him to send it on to Washington. At the Weather Bureau with Joseph Klein was John Blagden. John Blagden was a clerk in the Weather Bureau, and he had only been in Galveston for a couple of weeks. Joseph Klein and John Blagden encouraged Dr. Klein to return home to be with his family. They said there was nothing else that could be done there at the Weather Bureau. Isaac Klein started walking home. He started walking, but by the time he reached his house, he was waiting. The water was already up to his waist. At that time, he realized that Galveston was not half underwater. Galveston was completely underwater. Galveston was no longer an island. It was simply a part of the ocean floor with odd-looking buildings protruding from a very rough surface. When Dr. Klein entered his house, he found 50 people there. And they said, now, Dr. Klein, we know your attention to detail, and you built this house, so if there's one house in Galveston that's going to stand up during this storm, it will be yours. Even the people who built the house for him were there in his home. So Dr. Klein said everyone was welcome. Meanwhile, back at the Weather Bureau, Joseph Klein took that last message. He went to the telegraph office and tried to send it to Washington, but all the telegraph lines were down. So he found a telephone and he called the message into Houston and asked them to relay it to Washington. After he made that call, all the telephone lines were down. Now Galveston's isolation was complete. There would be no more communicating with the outside world for 24 hours. And when that word was finally received, it would be so devastating as not to be believed. Around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Zachary Scott was at St. Mary's Hospital, and he heard one of the sisters talking about a county facility for senior women that was located a half a block south of St. Mary's. And the sister was saying that she was very concerned about the senior residents over there. The building was not standing up against the high winds. So Zachary Scott and several of the men from St. Mary's went over to that building, and they found that it was falling apart. So Zachary started helping to get the residents over to St. Mary's. Those that could walk, he helped them. Those who could not walk, he carried. He made trip after trip. When he first started, the water was up to his calf. By the time he brought the last patient over, the water was up to his shoulders. There was only one resident of that county facility still there, Mary Sweeney, when the building collapsed and she was killed. Around 5 o'clock, John Blagden at the Weather Bureau took a reading, and he noted that the winds were blowing at 84 miles an hour, sustained winds at 84 miles an hour. Gusts were about 102. Then a few minutes later, he noted that the wind dramatically increased, and debris was flying down the street. The building started to shake, and he said, "I know we've gone past 100 miles an hour now." He said, I know I don't have to check again, but I think I'm going to look at the instruments. So John Blagden walked to the window and he looked out. But the force of the wind was such that every instrument used for measuring the velocity of the wind had been ripped from the side of the building. That's why no one knows the exact strength of the winds during the 1900 storm. Joseph Klein had left the Weather Bureau to hit on to the Klein residence to be there with the Klein family. He noted, too, that the water was rising rapidly, and it was up to his chest by the time he entered. Had the storm ended at that point, it would have already been a terrible storm, but it didn't end. At approximately 7:30, a great 20-foot tidal surge slammed into the south side of the city. This wave hit with such force that houses were lifted from their foundations and sent like battering rams into other houses. Houses fell upon houses like dominoes. Whole blocks of homes fell upon blocks. And inside those houses were people. People who in a single moment were cast from the safety and security of their homes into the dark, tumultuous water. At about the time that tidal surge hit, Florence Clayes was looking out her front door. Florence was a teenager. She and her brother Ralph lived with the Allen family. Florence looked at this killer wave coming towards her, and she looked up at the top of it and thought she saw a barrel. And this wave is coming straight for her. And then she realized it wasn't a barrel, but it was a dead horse twisting in the water. This great wave hit the house. Eventually, the house, so weakened by this great tidal surge, was lifted from its foundation and also crashed. Florence and her brother Ralph ended up on pieces of debris, and they floated west to the west end of the island, trying desperately to stay alive. Dr. Isaac Klein happened to be looking out the back of his house when this great tidal surge came. Dr. Klein had designed his house to withstand the high wind and the high water, and it was doing just that. But then, a quarter-mile section of trolley track, the rails, the whole trestle, had been lifted from its foundation and tossed by the wind and the waves. It crashed against the Klein home. The Klein residence was lifted from its foundation. It floated for a few minutes, it tilted, and it sank. Joseph Klein was in one room with two of Isaac Klein's children. He grabbed them and pulled them towards him. He put his arms around them, and he ran backwards as the house tilted, and he crashed through a window and was free of the house. He looked around in the water, and he saw no one. He found a piece of roof that was floating, and he put the two children up on that and climbed up on it himself. And he kept looking in the water, trying to find any other survivor from the Klein home. Dr. Isaac Klein was in the room with his wife and his 6-year-old daughter, and he grabbed both of them. But then the house tilted, and they were pulled from him. And both were calling for them, and he was trying to reach them, but he couldn't. And he watched his wife, Cora May, become tangled in the debris and taken underwater. He was trying desperately to grab his little girl, but the force of the tilting of the house pushed him back against a chimney, and a great dresser came and blocked him, and he was trapped, and the house sank. Now, Dr. Klein was a very practical man, And when he realized that he couldn't move this dresser, he knew his life must be over. So he decided to end it quickly, and he took a deep breath and tried to fill his lungs with water. He passed out. A few moments later, he woke up, and his head was bobbing above the water. He had a big timber behind him, and another timber was perpendicular, pounding against his chest, forcing the water out. If that wasn't enough of a miracle, there was a flash of lightning. And in that flash, Dr. Klein looked ahead of him, and he saw his 6-year-old girl. And he grabbed her and pulled her towards him. There was another flash of lightning. And in that flash, Joseph Klein saw his brother Isaac and called to him. Isaac Klein took his 6-year-old daughter, and they swam over to the roof where his brother Joseph and the other 2 children were. And so Dr. Isaac Klein, his brother Joseph, and the 3 children began the long ordeal of trying to survive on this roof, floating in the water in the dark. At St. Mary's Hospital, the water filled the first floor. The sisters had to go up to the 2nd story. Zachary Scott was so exhausted after all he had been through in bringing the residents from the county house over that he went to a closet to take a nap. The sisters lined themselves up on the 2nd story balcony, and they would scoop in refugees as they floated by. The hospital was already packed. Most of the windows in the hospital were broken out, and the rain and the wind whipped through the hospital. And the sisters kept pulling in more and more storm victims and bringing them into the overcrowded hospital. At the Ursuline Academy, 1,500 Galvestonians went there seeking refuge. Of those 1,500, 4 were women who were pregnant, who immediately went into labor. The superior at that convent was a Mother Mary Joseph. She's a very organized individual. She had some of her sisters there helping to deliver the babies. She had some sisters positioned on the 2nd story balcony to bring in the refugees. She had other sisters providing first aid and others giving spiritual assistance to those who had lost everything. This Mother Joseph also kept the convent bell ringing throughout the night as a beacon to those who were lost in the dark. She's considered one of the great heroines of the 1900 storm. There reached a point in time that the north wall, the big brick wall surrounding the Ursuline convent, collapsed, and it made a terrible sound. Some of the people there in the convent became very nervous and started singing songs and saying they were all going to die. Well, this Mother Mary Joseph got a bell, and she walked around ringing this bell, and she quieted everyone down. And she said, "If you must sing, sing with the song in your heart. And I assure you that God, our Creator in heaven, will hear your song even over the roar of this great storm. But if you intend to be here, you must be quiet." So everyone was very quiet in that convent. This Mother Joseph of the Ursulines, her full name was Mother Mary Joseph Dowmer. And when she was 14 years old and a student at the Ursuline Academy, she had volunteered to help 3 sisters who had just arrived from France. But now she was the superior of the Ursulines and very definitely in charge. My grandfather was 6 years old during the 1900 storm, and I used to hear him tell the story many times. Actually, he didn't tell the story. It's more like he relived it. My father, who had served in the Army during World War II, was called back into the service during the Korean conflict. My mother and I went to live with my grandparents, and it was a wonderful experience for me because I could hear my grandfather tell these great stories. I was only 3 years old, but the way that he would tell them, it was as though they just happened yesterday. My grandfather said that the worst thing about the storm was the sounds. He said it sounded like 1,000 demons screaming in the night. He said he would hear children calling for their mothers. He said he would hear women screaming for help, and he would hear men begging for mercy from God. And he said he'd hear these sounds off in the distance, and they would be very faint. And then they would get louder and louder as the people would float by and then he would hear them get faint again. But he said sometimes, many times, those sounds would be abruptly cut off, and he said he knew that someone's life had ended. He said the sounds were terrible. He said the screaming of the people and the crying of the houses. And I remember when he said that very well, because my grandfather had a great sense of humor and he was always teasing. And when he said that, I said, Grandpa, I said, you're pulling my leg. I said, I know, because houses don't cry. And he said, that night, everything cried. I asked my grandfather if he cried. My grandfather was a big, tall man, and it was just inconceivable to me that he would have cried. But he told me, he said, the noises, the sounds were so awesome. And he said then he realized that outside, the water was already past the first floor. And he said he thought if he were downstairs, the water would be over his head, and that was scary. But then the house started to shift, and he said they thought the house was going to collapse. But his father got up and rushed to the pantry, and he came back with an axe and a hatchet and a crate opener. And he took the hatchet and he gave it to my grandfather's brother, and he put him down right at the door, right by the front door, and he said, cut through the floor. And he took the crate opener and he gave it to my grandfather, and he put him between the living room and the dining room, and he started cutting through the floor. And then he said his father took this axe and he went into the dining room and he threw back a chair, he kicked back the rug, and he sent this axe right into the dining room floor. And my grandfather said he and his brother were just frozen. They were watching their father chop through the dining room floor. It was unbelievable. Now, his father noted that my grandfather and his brother were not chopping. And so he said, chop through the floor. And this was 1900, so boys did exactly what they were told when they were told. So my grandfather said he started chopping away. And he said the harder he chopped, the harder he cried. And he said it wasn't just because he thought he was going to die. He said he already knew that. He said, but they were all going to die insane. This was madness. But of course, what happened? The water came up through the holes and flooded the house, and it settled it down. So, thanks to my great-grandfather's quick action, probably saved all of their lives. My grandfather was always very appreciative of that, and I am too. If not, you'd have Sister Marie Bernard here telling you the history of Galveston and trying to explain that you would have had a storyteller here, but her grandfather didn't make it, so her mother didn't, so she didn't. There was another family. It was a little girl. Her name was Lucy. And Lucy was with her mother and her father. And when the great tidal surge came, their house was shifted off of its foundation, and they knew that it was not going to last. But some men came by in a boat, and they offered to take little Lucy, who was 7 years old, and her mother. They said they didn't have room for the father, but they would take the two of them. Well, that seemed the best decision at the time, so the two were placed in the boat. Now, little Lucy didn't want to leave her father. That scared her being away from her papa. So her mother grabbed her and put her in the boat and kept her arm around her. And Lucy watched the porch, and she watched her father from the porch. And he waited. He said, it's all right. He said, I'll be with you soon. It's all right. I'll come get you. I'll take you home. It's all right. I'll be with you. I'll take you home. And for as long as Lucy could watch, with the wind and the rain beating on her face, she watched her father, and she cried. She wanted to be with him. And she kept calling, Papa, Papa. But finally, in the darkness, she couldn't see him anymore. Lucy and her mother were taken to the Jesuits' residence. There, Lucy laid on the floor, sopping wet. She laid there so she could watch the door. And she watched and she waited for her father, who never came. Throughout the night, families were separated and lost forever. Around midnight, the winds died down and the water receded. A bright full moon came out. The people of Galveston looked out on a devastated island. The dead were everywhere. Florence and Ralph had been floating on this piece of driftwood, and when the storm ended, they started walking back and towards the city because they had been taken way out to the west. All that Florence had on was a little lace necklace. Her brother managed to find a tarp and wrap it around her, and they started walking into the city. There was an apartment complex not far from St. Mary's Hospital. It was completely destroyed. There was only one room left, and a handful of people were huddled in there. Those folks started coming into the city, and what they saw before them was a gigantic wall of debris. At places, it was 2 stories tall. This great wall wrapped itself around St. Mary's Hospital to the east. Then it zigzagged along to 15th and Broadway, and then from there out to 39th Street. Inside this wall, there were pieces of houses, furniture, pianos, pots, pans, cats, dogs, and people. People who were dead and those who were dying. Daisy Thorne and other folks from this apartment complex reached this wall, and they knew they had to climb over it. But as they climbed, they could hear the screams from the people inside of this wall. And at first they started moving pieces of furniture, moving the boards, trying to get to the folks who were buried there. But every time they would move something, then something else would fall, and there would be more screams. So they finally decided there was nothing that they could do, and they climbed over the wall and went into the city. That next morning, September the 9th, a Sunday, it's considered a most beautiful day. The sunshine came out. The people of Galveston looked around, and they couldn't believe the sights that they saw. At St. Mary's Hospital, all the food and water had been destroyed. The hospital was crowded with people. A couple of the sisters decided to see what they could find, so they started going around the streets of the hospital. They found a grocery store that had been destroyed, and in the rubble, they found crackers and cookies that had been soaked in the water. That's all they could find. So they brought that back to the hospital. And in the street, they built a fire, and they dried the crackers and the cookies over this fire. And that's what they served to the patients and the refugees who had come into St. Mary's Hospital. There was great concern about the orphanage. What had happened out there? Zachary Scott volunteered to ride out there to check on the sisters and on the orphans. He borrowed a horse and he rode out there. When he came back, the sisters rushed out to greet him, but he didn't say a word to them. And they could tell by the expression on his face that it was not good. Zachary Scott went directly to the Mother Superior, and he said, "It's gone." And she said, "It's gone? What do you mean? Did they go somewhere else? What happened?" He said, "No, it's gone. It's as though a broom has swept the land clean." And she says, "Well, maybe you went to the wrong place." He said, "No, I could tell by the great salt cedar trees, but it's gone." It wasn't until 3 days after the storm that the sisters found out what happened at the orphanage. 3 of the orphans survived, and 2 came in the hospital to tell their story. That morning of the storm, there had been 2 big dormitories, 2-story dormitories at the orphanage. The girls' dormitory was to the east, the boys' to the west. They had big balconies that faced out over the Gulf. Large sand dunes supported by great salt cedar trees were between the Gulf and the dormitories. The boys told the sisters that beginning early that afternoon, the water from the Gulf was rising, and it was eroding the great sand dunes as though the sand dunes were made of flour. The water continued to rise. The sisters brought all of the children in to the girls' dormitory, which was the newer and stronger of the 2. There were 93 boys and girls. These orphans came from all over the state. They ranged in age from 2 years old to 12 years old. On the first floor of the girls' dormitory, the sisters had all the orphans sing, "Queen of the Waves." But the water continued to rise. So the sisters had Henry Esquior, the handyman, collect clothesline rope. The water rose so much that they had to take all the children to the second story. Once on the second story, the sisters took the clothesline rope and they cut it into sections. And the sisters tied the clothesline rope to the cinchers which they wore around their waist, and then tied the other end to the children. And each sister tied to herself between 6 and 8 children. The older children were allowed to be on their own and to help care for the younger ones. The boys said that 2 of the 2-year-olds were just so frightened that one of the sisters held on to them. And she held them in her arms and she promised she would not let them go. And they held on to her very tightly, and she had this big grasp around them. And she said, "Don't worry, I'll hold on to you." Around 7 o'clock, they heard the crash of the boys' dormitory as it was lifted from its foundation and torn to pieces. And the sound scared the children. But the sisters had them again sing Queen of the Waves, and they tried to calm them down. And the boys who survived said, the children were very frightened, and the sisters were very brave. Around 7:30, the great tidal surge came in, and it lifted the girls' dormitory. It floated for a few minutes, and then the bottom fell out. The roof came crashing down, and the sisters and the children were trapped inside. Frank Madera was 12 years old at the time. He saw a log, and he swam to it. A few minutes later, 2 of the other boys from the orphanage swam to that same log. There were ropes that were tied to this log, so evidently someone had been using the log before. These 3 boys looked around and they could see no one else, and they are the only survivors from the orphanage. For the next day and a half, those 3 boys floated on that log. Now, it's not surprising all they had been through that they hallucinated. But what is unusual is they saw the same things at the same time, and to them it was very real. Floating on this log, they looked in the water, and they saw people walking about. They were dressed in their Sunday best, just walking about, very happy, talking to one another. And then they saw the trolley running by. And then they saw the sisters from the orphanage tucking the little children into their beds. Finally, they were rescued from the log that was trapped out in the Gulf. A ship came out and picked them up and brought them into the city. Frank Madera had an injury to the head, and he was taken to a church as there was no room at the hospital. 2 of the boys were brought into the hospital to tell their story. The sisters were buried wherever they were found, with the orphans still tied to them. Reports said that there were 2 sisters found on the mainland. One of the sisters was tightly holding on to 2 very small children. Even in death, she had not let go. The dead were everywhere. At first, morgues were set up, and wagons went up and down the streets collecting the dead, and they took them to the first morgue. That filled. They had a second morgue and a third, and they filled so quickly that the people of Galveston knew they had to do something else. There were so many dead that it was decided to put them on barges and take them out to sea for burial. 800 bodies were collected for that first barge. Father Kerwin of St. Mary's Cathedral prayed with a parishioner over the body of the man's mother-in-law, and they placed the body with the other 800 people on the barge, and it was taken out to sea. 2 days later, this parishioner went running up to Father Kerwin, and he said, "Father Kerwin, my mother-in-law is back." Well, Father Kerwin just related that to the stress of the situation. But then the man said, "They're all back." And he was right. The bodies buried at sea, improperly weighted, had returned to the shore. After that, it was decided that the bodies should be burned or buried wherever they were found. After the storm, the people of Galveston had a decision to make, whether to stay or to build a new city on the mainland. Some Galvestonians did decide to leave. but the vast majority of islanders were determined to rebuild and reclaim their city. With a deep faith in God our Father, the sisters were determined to continue their mission in Galveston, despite the great 1900 storm. They repaired St. Mary's Hospital, and 1 year after the hurricane, reestablished the orphanage. The people of Galveston decided that in order for the city to be made safe, they had to build a great wall facing the sea. It took from 1902 to 1904 to build this wall. It began to the north of St. Mary's Hospital on 8th Street. It shifted just a little bit and went down what is now 6th Street, going to the beach. Then it turned and went out to 39th Street. The wall itself stretched for more than 3 miles. It cost $1.5 million. It was 17 feet tall, 16 feet wide at the base, and 5 feet wide at the top. Each monolith section of this wall took a full day to pour and a full week to dry. Once the great seawall was built, then the level of the city had to be raised. Dikes were built around sections of the city. Small houses and big buildings alike were raised on jacks. Sludge from the Gulf and Bay was pumped in underneath. Catwalks were used to get people to and from their houses. The grade raising took 6 years to complete. Now, this grade raising and the building of the seawall was designed by a 3-member board. The chairman of that board was General H.M. Robert. Few people remember today that it was General Robert who came up with this design, but yet most people are familiar with his name. He wrote a little booklet designed to help people conduct meetings. It's called Robert's Rules of Order. But it was General H.M. Robert who chaired the 3-member board that designed our seawall and orchestrated our grade raising. In the fall of 1900, Zachary Scott started medical school. After graduation, he practiced in Austin, Texas. He was a specialist in the study and treatment of tuberculosis. Dr. Zachary Scott founded the Easter Seals of Texas. He had a son, Zach Jr., who decided to pursue a career in acting rather than medicine, and he became a Hollywood actor. Dr. Isaac Klein survived the great storm of 1900, but he lost his wife, Cora May. Dr. Klein was promoted to become chief of the Weather Bureau in New Orleans. His brother Joseph became chief of the Weather Bureau in Puerto Rico and then Dallas. In 1955, at the age of 93, Dr. Isaac Klein died. His brother Joseph, who was in his 80s, was living in Dallas. He received word of his brother's death and died 1 week later. Mother Mary Joseph Dahmer of the Ursulines became Assistant Superior of all English-speaking Ursulines in the world. She was called to Rome, where she later died, and that's where she's buried. Wherever the sisters are in the world, they pause on September the 8th and sing Queen of the Waves. They pause and remember the 10 sisters and 90 children who died during the great 1900 storm. One of the orphans who survived the storm, Frank Madera, said something in an interview in a Houston paper in the mid-1930s that reminded me of my grandfather. He said the worst part about the storm were the sounds. And he said, now, whenever I hear a storm, I go wild. He said, it's not that I'm afraid to die. It's not that. It's just that I wonder what might be out there. And then I hear the one terrible, solid scream of 100 children, and I can't sleep. My grandfather lived to be 88 years old. The last 2 years of his life, he couldn't tell you what day of the week it was, what year it was. Most of the time, he couldn't recognize his wife of more than 50 years. But whenever the wind started to blow, he would recall the great storm of 1900. No disease of the mind was strong enough to erase the memory of that storm. Now, little Lucy, she grew up and she married my grandfather's brother, James. So my whole life growing up, I heard Aunt Lucy talk about the great storm. And I never knew Aunt Lucy to tell that story. without being moved to tears. And I never knew anyone in her presence and to hear that story and not also be moved. And keep in mind, the first time she told me that story, the storm had been over for more than 50 years. Aunt Lucy lived to be 95 years old. She died in 1987. Her son, James Jr., told me that the last year and a half she was in a nursing home, and then the last week of her life she was in the hospital. And she said to him, "I just want to go home. I'm ready to go home." Shortly after that, she died. Her son James told me, he said, "While I grieve greatly at the loss of my mother, in my heart, I can't help but be filled with joy, because after waiting for almost 90 years, her father has finally come for her, and she has gone home." Now, when I start telling my storm stories, folks frequently say, "Linda, get a life. If not in this decade, at least in this century." But I do love the stories from the past. I love the stories that my grandfather told me and the stories of Aunt Lucy. And I love the stories of the Sisters of Charity. They help us to appreciate what we have today and to help us to understand where we are and why we're here. For example, I know that there have been times that I was very grateful that 21 cannons were not firing at me on New Year's morning. And sometimes in the cafeteria, I'll hear people say, "There's nothing good to eat today." And I remember the sisters serving the crackers and the cookies that had been soaked in water and dried over a fire. And I think about how really lucky I am to work for the Sisters of Charity, to experience their devotion, their commitment, and their love so pure that they would be willing to sacrifice themselves for others, as they did at the orphanage during the 1900 storm. I remember the stories of the great 1900 storm, and I know that all that is could be changed, could be gone overnight. But change is part of life. And I think of the stories of Mother Joseph and all that she did during the height of the great yellow fever epidemic. Whenever I think I have a workload, I think of her. What a difference she made. But history is not just some faraway time where men rode horses or bulls. Now is history. And we are all part of the history of the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. By living the vision and the mission, we too can make a difference as we carry on the legacy of the Sisters of Charity.